Hello and a very warm welcome. I'm Dr. Sandy Leaton-Gray, Associate Professor of Education at the UCL Institute of Education, and I'm your chair for this event. Thank you so much for joining us. Here at the IOE, we've had to take our events online, and this is the first in a new event series called IOE Coffee Breaks, which is going to provide an online forum for discussing the most important education issues of the day. This afternoon, we're looking at the sudden and dramatic disruption to this year's exams, which has generated considerable anguish for students, teachers and parents alike. Now, we'd like this event to be as interactive as possible, so please do send us your comments and questions throughout the discussion. You can do that via Twitter using the hashtag IOE Coffee Breaks. And we hope this event will be a really useful resource for people to check out at a later date as well. So we're going to post a recording on the IOE website in a few days' time. So as I've said, I'm Dr. Sandy Leaton-Gray. My own expertise is in the sociology of education, and it spans education policy, professional training, curriculum and assessment, as well as artificial intelligence and biometrics in education. And with me today, we have Dr. Mary Richardson, who directs the IOE's Master's Programme in Educational Assessment. Prior to joining the IOE, Mary was based at Roehampton University and the awarding body AQA. Her research has covered school-based examinations and testing regimes through to issues of public trust in exams and the use of new technologies in assessment. We also have Dr. Tina Isaacs, who prior to moving to the IOE spent much of her career with national agencies in the field of assessment, from the former National Council for Vocational Qualifications and the Qualifications and Curriculum Authority, through to Ofqual, where she was head of 14 to 19 regulation. Most recently, Tina led a major study comparing instructional systems around the world. So to start off with, Mary and Tina, Ofqual has set out its proposed approach for academic and vocational assessment for 2020. Could you briefly outline for us the main elements of what they're proposing and the main diversions from usual practice?
Okay, so thanks, Sandy, and thanks everybody for coming online this afternoon. So I'm going to make a start just by briefly outlining some of the key issues here, and then Tina's going to take over because her expertise is in 16 to 19 vocational qualifications, so she'll be able to tell you a lot more about that. But basically, what we would normally expecting at this time of year is that candidates would be taking their examinations, GCSEs, A-levels, etc. And then the results of those examinations would go back to the awarding bodies and they would be awarded like any other cycle. So the majority of students and young people around the country who are taking a GCSE or an A-level would be expecting to get results for that exam in August this year. Now, of course, what's happened with the coronavirus is that we can't actually run examinations in the same way that we would have done. It's just not possible to do that, and it's not safe to do that. So the exam boards and Ofqual have had to make some really tough decisions in recent weeks about what they want to do and how to take forward all of that education that students have covered to date, to try and find the best possible way to help them move forward, whether that's to the next year of schooling, or whether it's to go on to a different place of education, or whether it's to leave school and go into the workplace. And obviously the change this year is difficult and different. And that's what I hope we'll start to unpack a bit this afternoon, is what people's concerns are about those changes. Because this year, for the first time, it's going to be a very different combination of evidence that's going to be put together in order to create awarding outcomes. It won't just be exam results, it will be a mixture of teacher evidence gleaned from schools, and that's not simply based on teachers just plucking a set of marks and deciding what they are. It's other evidence from teachers who know their pupils the best, And that will be given to the awarding bodies or the exam boards to actually work with, and they use a system of modelling that data to present outcomes. So what I'll do is hand over to Tina, because I'm sure she's got a few more things to add. Thanks, Tina.
Right. So just so that I don't confuse anybody, my expertise is actually mostly with academic qualifications, but I, in the past, have worked with vocational qualifications and try to keep abreast of what is going on. So I don't want to missell myself. The difference, so there are two main differences between vocation-related qualifications and academic ones. One makes life a bit more complicated, but the other makes life a bit easier. So I'll start with the easier bits. Unlike GCSEs and A-levels, for example, vocational qualifications quite frequently have a great deal of teacher assessment as an ongoing thing, continuous assessment throughout the program, which means that teachers will have, teachers and lecturers will have already gathered quite a bit of evidence that has been moderated in the school or college or workplace setting. So that's the good news. There's more evidence. The complication is that vocational qualifications are used for three things. One is for progression. So in that sense, like GCSEs and A-levels, getting someone from where he or she is to where he or she wants to go in an additional program. Then there's the mix, which I'll leave for last. But on the other extreme, you've got vocational qualifications that assert competence. And so where you have something where there's a guarantee that someone has had sufficient learning and sufficient on-the-job training and whatnot to say he or she is competent to go into employment, then you need to have hands-on evidence of that. So, and then there's the mixed purpose group, which are kind of fall somewhere in the middle of that continuum. So for the progression qualifications, basically say something like BTEC Nationals, they will follow the pattern of A-levels and GCSEs. So they will be based on calculation. But at the other extreme, the occupational competence qualifications, they will, the awarding organizations will be asked to adapt their assessment. And if they cannot adapt, then they need to delay. Whereas with the progression qualifications, the starting point is calculation, the fallback is adaptation, and at a last resort delay. So there is a difference there.
So it's very difficult times, isn't it? Because on the one hand, students are going to have to be quite understanding about all the changes that are going on in assessment. And teachers are going to have to be very flexible about the way that they approach assessment when they've been really used to a very rigid structure in the past. So it's interesting times, is it not? So that leads me on to another question. And I'm thinking, so if we're putting teachers more centrally in this assessment process, that could be seen as quite controversial. And I'm wondering if you could both sum up for us what kinds of concerns have been voiced about this and by whom, and whether you think those concerns can be justified. Mary.
Thank you. I think I'm a great user of social media, so I'll start there. I think you have to be really careful, obviously, about social media, because it is a place where, you know, unregulated speech to all extents and purposes goes on. And you need to be careful about the kind of commentary that's made there. But that's the place where I go as a researcher of education to try and get a sense of the conversations and discourses that surround all these issues. And I think one of the biggest things for me, and it's something I've been researching for a few years now, is this notion of a lack of trust in teachers' professional judgments very often. we put the most precious people in our lives, our children, into the hands of teachers every day quite happily. But then when it comes to allowing them to make very significant decisions on behalf of and with children, the response seems to be something quite different. And I think that is hugely problematic in terms of how we trust what teachers do. Because teachers are professionals. And one of the things that I have seen commonly this year, and even good friends, colleagues, etc., have questioned me about, has been, well, surely, what if the teacher doesn't like me, my child? What if they're biased against us? What will that mean? And I think this is very telling, because what it's showing us is that quite commonly we're starting from a benchmark of no trust. And it's not as simple as that. And I think it's really important that we have to understand that teachers want the best for their pupils. I've never met a teacher who's gone into teaching who wants to harm pupils. And I've also never met a teacher, though, who wants to go into teaching to teach their children or the students how to pass exams. You know, education and teaching is something more than that. And I think there are a lot of peripheral kind of arguments and issues around education at the moment that are coming out because of this. So whilst it's controversial and it's raising controversy, I actually think this is an amazing opportunity for us to see just what it is that teachers do and the amazing role that they actually play in the system.
So it sounds like it's a little bit of a litmus paper so that we can test, if you like, other areas of education that have been under scrutiny a lot later. Tina, what are your thoughts?
Well, again, with teachers and lecturers who are offering vocationally related qualifications, this is so much less of an issue, because in those programs, we do trust teachers. And external assessment is maybe 25, 30% of the qualification. So teachers have been judging their students for as long as vocational related qualifications have been out there. We used to do that more in academic qualifications with coursework. Over the last few years, we have cut back on coursework dramatically. And so we have cut back on that element of teacher judgment. There's, of course, that old saw, trust but verify. There are all sorts of ways of having moderation systems in place, to have checks and balances in place so that we can trust teacher judgment, but also look into it more deeply and more systematically rather than letting 1,000 flowers bloom. The other issue around trust, of course, is the accountability system that we've got. So as long as schools are judged by their qualification results, teachers will teach to tests. They will prepare their students to take those tests. I did, Mary did. You must do that, because the student's future, but also the school or college's future, depends on it.
So there's a whole kind of raft of questions really about the role of professionals in this. And I'm wondering what individual teachers and schools or colleges can do to make sure that their assessments are can survive scrutiny really and appear robust. And we've had a question come in from a member of the public asking, what should we make of the finding that only 49% of secondary school teachers think that GCSE and A-level students will all get a fair deal from their teacher assessed grades? What can the profession do to make sure that this is a very robust process? Mary.
Thanks. Yes, we did think that this figure would come up today, and I think it's timely, actually. It's also a really strong indicator of how the teaching profession feels at the moment as well, and I think that's really important that we take that into account. I don't believe that those teachers who have been polled necessarily are incapable of creating a secure and reliable judgment. But I think part of the problem is, do they actually believe in themselves? And I think that's a really important question we should be asking policymakers and government, more importantly. Why is it that in one of the most important professions, one of the most necessary professions as well to educate people, are teachers not feeling that they can make these kind of decisions, that they can actually provide and estimate, student attainment correctly? And it's because of the things, particularly what Tina mentioned just now, this accountability. What you do find from year to year is that, there are reports from Ofqual and others to do with the ways in which teachers try to game the system, etc. And actually, the numbers are tiny as a percentage of the overall teacher population that are recorded each year. But from a purely academic point of view, when I read those sorts of reports and look at that, I would think, well, if I was under that much pressure, I might do the same thing. If you put people under so much pressure, you make it very, very difficult for them.
So if I could weigh in here, I just want to stress that the calculated grade is partially the responsibility of a pure teacher judgment, of course, based on homework and mocks and everything that the students have been doing over the course of the last year and a half. So there's a lot of evidence out there, but the calculated grade will be based on that, plus prior performance, plus the school or college's performance over the last few years. So we don't have the exact details on how that's going to work, but it's a system where there's more than one there's more than one arrow in the quiver. And it's certainly one of the first rules of assessment is never make a judgment based on one piece of evidence. And this is a year where there's going to be more and more varied evidence playing into the mix, which I find very heartening, frankly.
Can I add something to that, Sandy?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think also it is just, as Tina said, that mix is so important for people to understand. I think part of the discourse that's out there at the moment is people are just imagining that teachers are just sort of sitting alone at a desk going, okay, well, that child's getting 10, they're getting 9, and just filing some papers. It's not happening like that. Assessment doesn't work like that in education. And that's another big problem we have. We really need to help people in the public arena to understand what's going on so that they can feel more trust in the system. And I think that would really help things too. Actually, how these things are explained and how they're described is so important.
So in the framework of that, what about the optional exams and practical assessments that have been talked about as possibly happening in the autumn? Is that feasible? And what sort of considerations do you think that might raise? Tina, can I go to you first?
Sure. Well, the principles that Ofqual has published say that these autumn assessments should come into force if they are not overburdensome for centers or overburdensome for the awarding organizations. I just want to put that down. I know that a lot of teachers and lecturers are concerned about the autumn assessments, whether they can gear up for it. Frankly, things that we don't really think about that much as moms and dads, just getting the gym available, or the auditorium, or the few large rooms that a school has for a set of autumn assessments. Gearing students up for them who will not have necessarily been in education in the summer. We don't know when schools and colleges are going to open up again. So there are a lot of worries about those assessments. I suspect, and this is just a guess, that when it comes to, say, GCSEs, that schools will privilege mathematics and English autumn assessments over every other assessment.
We've had an interesting comment from Dr. Canayo, pointing out that the kind of oppressive accountability that we were referring to earlier has the effect of stifling teacher autonomy and teacher self-efficacy when it comes to high stakes assessment. I'm thinking if we're looking forward to summer 2021, what about students due to take their exams or practical assessments then? They're going to have had their learning really disrupted partway through the course. We don't know whether public health measures will be in place and what will that look like. We don't know, as Tina says, whether we'll be able to hold traditional exams in halls. I mean, certainly as a university, UCL has had to give that an enormous amount of consideration because we routinely have tens of thousands of exams going on in exhibition halls, and we haven't been able to do that, and people still need degrees. So every educational institution is having to be very mindful of that. So what do we need to be thinking about now for school leaving assessments next year in terms of the pupil experience and also teacher confidence almost in the ability to deliver what's required? Mary.
So, oh, sorry.
Oh, Tina.
Tina, you can go first if you like.
Okay. I again just wanted to start with a little bit of reassurance. Although I obviously don't know this for a fact, I suspect that the summer 2021 exams will come under the same sort of rules that exams have done in the past, which is something that's called comparable outcomes. And if comparable outcomes are in place, that will ensure that students aren't penalized. It basically, the argument is that if you have a group of students this year who are roughly comparable to last year and the year before, you can base that on prior performance. Then the outcomes of the exams should be the same. So I think something along those lines would happen. I'm hopeful, however, that the awarding organizations and Ofqual will very, very quickly put in a program of research on the reliability of teacher judgment and teacher assessments based on what's happening in 2020 in order to see whether, in fact, it is safe to continue having teacher judgment as part of the mix.
Mary, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree largely with what Tina said. I mean, I think looking forward, it's really hard to know at the moment exactly what will happen. I'm immensely hopeful that something really good in terms of what we understand about teacher assessment will come out of the experiences this year. And that will change how we look at national testing in this country and globally, because you have to remember, that's what everyone forgets at the moment, this is happening all over the world. As an assessment researcher, this is one of the most kind of interesting times, much as it's hugely, obviously, stressful and difficult time for everybody. It's very interesting to try and see in educational terms where we are going and what will happen from this. And also just looking forward, I mean, I won't make myself popular now with any of the awarding bodies in England, but I'm not sure at all now whether it's why we actually even need GCSE examinations in this country anymore. I don't actually necessarily see the purpose of them. And I wonder if this summer could be that opportunity where teachers step forward and we see how good they are at making secure and fair judgments as part of an overall system. And that helps us to move forward to starting to rely less on what is a very, very expensive and very complex testing system, and one that's extremely stressful for 16-year-olds, when actually at that point in your life and the way that our education system is structured, perhaps that's not something we need anymore. So I see lots of opportunity ahead.
Yes, we talk a lot about how the school leaving age has changed, and yet the sort of milestones of the assessment process aren't corresponding anymore. Now, you stay at school till 18 in a lot of countries, actually. And of course, the UK is one of the few countries that does high stakes assessment at 16. So yes, a very interesting question, and one to be thinking about very much over the coming months. We've had a couple more questions in from members of the public. So Estefania asks, what about the assessment of soft skills? They're much more difficult to test during the pandemic, but still important to students' success. Mary, what thoughts have you on that?
This is where teacher assessment comes to the fore. It's looking at how we actually present evidence for that kind of assessment and how we value it. One of the reasons, and I should make this really clear actually, because you know, I'm on a public forum, I'm not against exams and tests. A lot of people imagine, oh, you must hate them all and want to get rid of them. I don't. For certain subjects and in their place, they're the right kind of assessment. Okay, we don't look at it in those very blank terms of that one is good and the other is bad. It depends on what you need your assessment for. But the assessment of soft skills is really important, because those so-called soft skills are actually the skills that you are likely to use the most and need to actually demonstrate very frequently in a workplace or in higher education or whatever it is you might be going on to do in your future life. I think the only way that that can be done is through some kind of record that is led by teachers, but is also worked in partnership with students. So we're bringing the other face of assessment in here, this idea of using formative and reflective practice in assessment, not just relying on exam results.
Yes, and it's been interesting for a lot of young people going through the being schooled at home experience, where marks start to matter less and less, and intellectual inquiry has to sometimes matter a lot more, particularly in schools where they're not delivering, you know, very strictly timetabled online learning. And a lot of parents are having to navigate that tightrope really between wanting their kids to kind of pursue some kind of scholarly behavior in what might be the daytime kind of vague schooling hours, but not knowing how to do the marks on particular things, and not being able to necessarily push particularly rigid syllabus-based subject content forwards, but wanting a broader learning opportunity, more like you would have in a kind of typical homeschooling environment, but to do all the good bits of homeschooling, where you might go and visit a zoo or a farm or the seaside or something like that, or, you know, local area, and really meet with other groups of children and so on. So it's a very odd environment for parents to find themselves in at the moment. And as I say, it sort of magnifies some of the debates we've been having about the future of assessment and marks and formative versus summative assessment and so on.
Sandy,
we've had a comment. Oh, sorry, Tina.
I just wanted to interrupt briefly before we go on, which is, since we're not here to talk about homeschooling, but you brought it up. I think that we're all very worried about students who have less access to electronic equipment, who have to share computers with brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers, who students with special educational needs. It's all very worrying for students who actually won't have the educational experience that other students have at home. So apologies for the interruption.
No, you're right. And we've relied on a model where they often have somebody sitting by them in the classroom, or one-to-one in school, or small group tuition in school. And if you take away the human contact, that's really difficult to deliver. So again, huge imagination is required to try and work out how do you support young learners who don't automatically find themselves able to just access as kind of an online offer, if it's even there. And so, I can think of no bigger challenge for the teaching profession at the moment. Anyway, going back to our comment from Ben Breen, he said that the focus of education policy on outcome over process has coupled with assumed incompetence to create a situation where teachers are struggling to know whether they're acting with integrity. And I'm just wondering what both of you think about the future of teacher professionalism in the light of all of this. Where can teachers look to get that kind of guidance? Mary.
I think one of the places that does need to address this is in teacher education programs around the country. What has happened to teacher education in the past decades has been basically quite catastrophic in many senses, in the way that it's been taken apart, the way that the professional training and education of teachers, and I keep using that word because we're not just training teachers to deliver a curriculum in this country. That's, delivery people deliver, and that's a great thing that they do. Teachers are there to educate people and to help people make sense of the world, make sense of their lives. And I think that our teacher education systems actually need to have more of this in more of this practice built within that curriculum. We also need to spend more money on providing continual professional development for teachers in this country. Those budgets have been slashed back and back constantly in recent years. And again, with such an important profession, you wouldn't expect professional medical staff to never be retrained as they progress through their career, as new equipment and new ways of working and new groundbreaking medical science happens. You would expect them to learn to be able to take that on and to change their practice. Teaching is no different in that sense. We learn more and more constantly. It doesn't stand still. And I think we need to make sure that we actually see this as a profession to invest in. Because the other thing that most people don't realise in this country is we are on the edge of a precipice of not having enough teachers in our state schools. And most people don't realise that in the next few years, it's going to reach a critical point where we won't have enough teachers. And we need to be able to attract people into the profession.
So returning to the idea of continuous professional development, one very practical thing that a school or college could do is make that professional development continuous. That is, not have these sort of one-off superstar deliverers come in and bore people to death for 3 hours and then everybody goes away and forgets that it ever happened. To choose a theme that you will have professional development around over the course of an entire school year, so sustained practice over a year in, obviously, I would say, in assessment, but it could be a different theme. That's the way. That is one of the very practical ways forward, not doing it as a one-off.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and linked to some kind of validation process can be quite helpful for people, so that there's some kind of coherence to an offer. I mean, quite often teachers are doing what they might think is continual professional development, but it's a kind of briefing on school policy or academy chain policy or something like that, and that's not what we mean here, is it?
No.
We're thinking about the sense of educare, of leading out, that education is supposed to be rooted in a kind of broader, more holistic sense. Teachers are senior learners is a phrase that a lot of people use. So thinking about more detailed issues for 2020 in particular, I'm wondering how embedded governors and parent representatives ought to be in the way that schools are planning and managing the process of setting grades. And what about professional bodies and employers and so on? So, Mary, could you give us an idea of where you think that's going?
I think obviously the role of parents and governing bodies in schools is immensely important, but I keep coming back to the same argument with this. Really, it's how much how much understanding do people feel they really have? And how powerful are they in decision making around something as important as assessment? And, you know, on the one hand, I think, yes, they should be able to have, you know, a very strong voice in decision making going forward. But quite often it isn't the way. That's not what happens. We have now an increasingly top-down education system in which, you know, policy, etc., is directed from the top down and instructions are given out. And whilst people may say, you know, watching this, well, so what? We're a very unusual education system in that regard. And if you look back in our history of education, we have come from a, you know, a point in the 1800s where the government was extremely hands-off in making any decisions about what was going on, to now where we've got a system that is so hyper regulated and centrally regulated that it informs that. And I think it's difficult because you get different responses as well from the outside looking in. But some of those are incredibly useful. So just to add to a point Tina made before, the Institute for Fiscal Studies report that came out this morning, it talks about the contentious issue of reopening schools again. But the point it makes is really important. The people who are losing out the most, who will lose out the most in their schooling, in their assessment, and in all other factors of education going forward, are pupils from the lowest socioeconomic groups in this country. And I'm not saying education can fix this, but education is a helpful lever. But what we need to do is say, this is the truth. This is what's happening out there to a large sector of society at the moment.
And Tina, what do you think about the role of professional bodies and employers in vocational assessment? How much influence do you think they'll have?
They have a great deal of influence already. It is they who help shape these qualifications, and all of the awarding organizations have employer groups that work with them in order to develop these qualifications. And the employers, the consultations that went out, I know the one for the vocational and vocationally related qualifications, the consultation, it was open for employers to be able to say what, you know, how 2020 should shape up for vocationally related qualifications. So again, I think that in that world, you have far more hands-on influence if you are an employer.
So it sounds like there's different sort of stakeholders here with different levels of power and so on. One final question, because we've just got a few minutes left now. I'm wondering about the potential role of artificial intelligence in assessments, which has received a lot of attention recently. I'm wondering how that might work in practice in a kind of public health future, if you like, and also in the light of all these changes that have been imposed on us. Would it provide a degree of resilience to the kind of disruptions in assessment that we've seen this year? Mary, what are your thoughts on that?
I think the research we're seeing now is showing that AI technology does have a really strong role to play in assessment, and there is some excellent work going on globally and locally. I think one of the main issues around it is accessibility, making sure that everyone has equal access to opportunities to be able to use the technology. Of course, it's not perfect, but it's giving people generally a much better access to opportunities to take tests, to participate in assessments. And it's a better way also to link people and link up and co-communicate ideas. And so I think that going forward, there is a lot that we can learn from the work that's already out there.
Thank you. And Tina, we've got 1 minute left, very quickly.
Well, Mary and I are co-principal investigators on the TIMSS assessments, which were taken on tablets for the first year. And the children loved them, and the teachers thought that it was a great way of doing this particular assessment. So I am actually optimistic.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for all of your answers today. And thank you very much also to the members of the public that sent in questions. I'm sorry we haven't been able to get through all of them, but I hope we've touched on all of the main themes that were of concern to people. And remember, we're going to be running these events regularly, so we hope to see you online again.